Getting started.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being on this last of our series of winter webinars from University of Minnesota Extension. My name is Annalisa Hultberg, and I'm joined today by Ariel Pressman. Laura Backus is helping us with some tech. And thank you all for being here. We're going to talk about coolers on the farm, coolbots, walk-in coolers, and post-harvest quality. I will kick us off with a few slides. So at the University of Minnesota, we work with fruit and vegetable farmers around on-farm food safety. We provide GAP training, so trainings for understanding good agricultural practices, Food Safety Modernization Act, produce safety rule trainings. We will also help you review food safety plans, plan for a gap audit if that's something that you'd like on your farm, especially if you're starting to sell to school buyers or other wholesale buyers. We can really help you understand and meet those food safety requirements to sell to them. Um, we understand that product quality and food safety really go hand in hand. So many of you have attended food safety trainings in the past and really understand and use good food safety practices on your farm. The good thing is that when you do those things, like keep our totes clean, harvest clean, keep our hands clean, and keep our products cool, you're likely to have higher quality product that lasts longer on the shelf for your customers. So you can go to the next slide, Ariel. We have a number of upcoming workshops I wanted to really make sure to highlight. The most pertinent one for this work is next Tuesday, the 28th from 10 to 2. It is on the St. Paul campus of the university. We do have free parking and we'll provide instructions on parking, so don't get too worried about that. We only have a handful of spots left for that, and that is $15. Lunch is included with that. If you're interested, Lauren has put the link to that in the chat there. And then the second one is a series of high tunnel field day workshops, both in person and online, that my colleague Natalie Hoidel is leading. And these field days are about things related to high tunnels and soils and all kinds of things. On Tuesday, July 7th, Ariel and I will be there, and we will be talking about post-harvest handling in coolers, how to wash and cool vegetables for post-harvest quality safely. And these are on the St. Paul campus as well, near the Good Acre. So the Good Acre and the St. Paul campus have some high tunnels there, and so we will be there so you can practice harvesting product, washing it, and cooling it for product quality and safety.
And if I can just jump in real quick to give people a little more color about the cooler field day that we're doing next week, because we're both really excited about that. It is completely hands-on. So if you're kind of thinking about like, hey, I just went to the webinar, why would I go to the field day? We're going to be talking a lot about a lot of best practices now. We're literally going to be building a used cooler that me and Annalisa purchased for extension for these purposes. We're going to build it all. We're going to install the CoolBot. We're going to show you how to hook it up. Then we're going to take it all apart. We're going to help you figure out a lot of troubleshooting for if you were trying to buy a used box. So I'm going to talk about a lot of this later, but if you're a hands-on type person, we want to kind of remove the intimidation factor for a lot of this type of stuff and help build those skills and that confidence. So it's a pretty rare opportunity to be hands-on with this instead of just looking at slides. So really encourage people to show up if you're interested.
Thanks, Ariel. All right, so why coolers? I mean, it might seem obvious. You are all here because you think coolers are important, but just to kind of like go through some of the critical points here. So coolers on the farm do maintain some pretty important factors for your produce. First is product quality. There's a reason that we refrigerate our produce at home. We don't come home after harvesting or going to the grocery store and leave our leafy greens on the counter, and that is because they will wilt when they're at a room temperature. So that product quality requires cooling for almost all products, and we'll talk through kind of the things that don't need to go in the cooler, but many do. Product safety is another thing. So bacteria are everywhere, but pathogenic bacteria, the ones that can make humans sick, and then also the type of bacteria that can cause spoilage on our product will grow at room temperature and they will grow more quickly at room temperature. So cooling prevents those bacteria from growing. Therefore, if you did have some pathogenic bacteria, say on the greens broccoli that those kids are holding, at in cool temperatures, they would not grow. At room temperature, they would, and they would grow a lot more quickly. And the last is shelf life, and that goes hand in hand with quality, of course. When you're selling to someone like some larger schools or a food hub or a distributor, that group is going to buy the product and then move it to a different kitchen. And all of those moving might take days. And then it might sit in the cooler at that school or hospital or food service, college, and it might sit there for days more before, maybe a weekend hits or something. So it's really important that that shelf life be maintained. And you might not see that. You might hand off your product and say, that case of kale looks great. But if it wasn't properly cooled after 3 days, it very well might not look good. You might just not know that, and you might not get another sale. All right, you can go forward. So yeah, efficiency and quality of life on the farm. If we're harvesting, if we're always having to harvest directly before sale, well, it really minimizes the time when we can harvest. And it might be late at night. It might not fit in with our lifestyle. So really getting a cooler can improve the quality of life and then just the efficiency of your farm operation as you start to grow, as you start to scale up and build your sales. Having a place to store and cool down your product is going to be incredibly important, if not required. So, a wholesale customers, anybody who's potentially temping the product, they might not require a cooler, but they're going to potentially probably temp the product. And if the core, if the middle of that box isn't quite cool, that your load might get rejected because they know that they won't hold up over time in storage. So again, that product does have to last a lot longer than at farmer's market. And but those bacteria will thrive in warm conditions. They do well in situations like our guts. They are intended to be in the guts of us and animals. That's where they do well. And so when they're in warm, moist environments with food, they will proliferate. So next slide, just a indication of how quickly they can grow. So this exponential growth, you start with 2 bacteria, you're never probably going to start with just 2. But if you did, 20 minutes given ideal conditions, it's maybe 75, 80 degrees. After 8 hours, you could have as many as 16 million. And of course, this is ideal conditions. And in our pack shed, it might not be these ideal conditions, but you can see how that exponential growth happens. It can take fewer than 10 cells of some pathogenic bacteria, such as E. coli, O157H7, to make us quite sick. This is especially important when we're dealing with kids, the elderly, immune compromised. Really, only a few of these very, very, very tiny cells could make us sick. Of course, we don't want that to happen, would not be good for our farm, would not be good for those eaters, would not be good for the local food system. And then, of course, those same handling practices, like I mentioned, to improve food safety, also will just improve or make it more difficult for things like plant pathogens and spoilage causing organisms to also grow. So we're trying to set up conditions where bacteria can't grow on the vegetables. If they were there, they can't continue to reproduce there. And just at the bottom there are some types of pathogenic organisms that might come from fecal material, animals, sick humans. So by refrigerating, if there was a problem, if we did happen to get a little bit on some vegetables, that problem would stay small and it wouldn't grow in post-harvest. All right, that is it from me. We will hear from Ariel.
Hey everyone. All right. Well, I am guessing many of you have heard me talking at some point over the last couple webinars we've done. But if you haven't, my name's Ariel Pressman. I was a longtime certified organic vegetable farmer in Western Wisconsin. I've grown on a lot of different scales, started my farm at a half acre, Did a couple acres on rented land, and then eventually scaled up to doing about 15 acres of produce on a farm that I owned. And I currently do consulting work. And one of the places I work with the most is Annalisa at University of Minnesota Extension. I do a lot of work with both food safety, post-harvest processing, and also how that relates to people who are scaling up their farms. Understanding that, like Annalisa said, we often need different types of equipment and infrastructure, different ways to think about our farms if we're moving from maybe being a smaller farmers market farm to try and get larger and work with wholesale accounts. So today we're going to be talking about cold storage. I am going to be referencing CoolBots a lot, but I'm also going to be talking about more traditional walk-in coolers. But I wanted to start by just spending a good bit of time just talking about coolers, why we're using them, best practices for any type of cooler, so things that will apply no matter what type we're putting up. Then later in the presentation, we'll get into some specifics about costs, why you might consider a CoolBot or a traditional cooler, how you can find used supplies, kind of the real nitty-gritty about kind of actually putting up the structure. So, like Annalisa referenced before, we've got a reason we want cold storage. Um, it really affects how long the produce lasts. And so, in the end of the day, how long the produce lasts is really going to be determined by two factors. The first is how quickly the produce gets down to temperature. So, as in, if we're pulling produce out of the field at 80 degrees, how quickly to say that lettuce get down to 34 degrees where we want it to be. And then two, what temperature are we holding it at? So it's first how much time to get from, say, 80 to 34. And then second, are we holding at 34, 36, 40? Those are going to have a really big impact on how long our produce lasts. Produce stored without cold storage is going to spoil quickly. So those of you without a cooler, you unfortunately know this. And it's for all the reasons Annalisa brought up. This is especially true when it's warm outside. So you can maybe get away with this for longer in the spring. But if it's the summer and we harvest produce like, say, collard greens or lettuces or things that really can spoil quickly, and it's 85 degrees outside, it might even not last 3 or 4 hours. And people who have farmers market stands know this. It's really, really hard when you don't have refrigeration, the produce just sitting out in the hot air. It goes bad quick and it looks bad quick. So I just want to level set with what does go in the cold storage. Different crops have different storage temperatures, which we'll talk about in a second. But it's important to know that not every crop likes the same temperature, and not every crop even necessarily wants to be refrigerated. So this is a rough guide. I'm going to caution you that I think there's a difference between what, to my mind, is the more academic advice of how produce should be stored versus the practical realities on a small farm. So the academic advice is you're going to find very, very specific recommendations for almost every type of crop. Some things might want to be 34, some might want to be 42, 47. I've tried to break this down into just three general categories of kind of produce that wants to be as cold as possible, as close to 32 as possible, produce that likes to be a little warmer, like 40 to 50, and then produce that likes to be really warm, at least for produce, between 50 and 60. So in general, things that like to be close to 32 degrees are going to be anything that's a leafy green, so it's got a lot of leaf to it. Also crops like onions, carrots, radishes, crops like that. Between 40 to 50 degrees are generally going to be a lot of solanaceous type crops. So peppers and eggplant, tomatoes, and also some cucurbits. So you've got cucumbers, you've got zucchini, summer squash, things like that. And then between 50 and 60 are items like winter squash, watermelons, and sweet potatoes. So it's just good to keep in mind in general that we do have different temperatures where different types of produce are going to be happy. They're not all going to want to be at the same temperature. Okay, that being said, like I mentioned, there's realities of on the farm, right? So even those of us that have a walk-in cooler probably do not have 3 or 4 walk-in coolers. And I don't think you should be worrying yourself as a small diversified farmer about having that many storage temperatures. So generally the way small farms tend to think about this is two types of storage. You've got cold storage for the crops that need more refrigerated type temperatures. So that kind of like 32-degree range and then that 40 to 50-degree range. And then you've got crops that are okay at ambient temperatures. And so by that I mean just like whatever temperature it is outside. So those might be crops like winter squash, where maybe it'll last longer at 50 to 60, but the reality is it's probably going to last a sufficient amount of time if it's in a cooler area, if we're just kind of keeping it out in our pack shed somewhere. So keep in mind that the temperatures I offered up, those ranges, those are the ideal temperatures, so that's where they will last the longest. You don't have to keep them at that temperature to have an acceptable shelf life. So, for example, many of us that have CoolBots will know the CoolBot really doesn't do well trying to get the temperature down to 32. It does a much better job at, say, 36. It's very, very normal for produce farmers to keep their cooler temperature at 35, 36 degrees. In the end of the day, your produce will not last as long as if it had been at 32. But for most farmers, for most purposes, that's an acceptable temperature range. And again, don't get intimidated into thinking you need three or more temperature zones. Like I said, on my farm, we did a lot of wholesale. We did 15 acres of produce. That was hundreds of thousands of pounds of produce every year. I only had two places I kept the produce. I had a big walk-in cooler that we kept cold, and then I had kind of a warm zone where I kept things like tomatoes. Um, Again, if you're lucky enough to have a couple different coolers, that's great, but I don't want anybody leaving this webinar thinking I'm not doing cold storage right if I don't have a bunch of different kind of temperature ranges being represented. You have to be very, very careful with the storage of particular types of crops. And particularly crops like tomatoes and apples, if you're growing them on the farm. And that's because tomatoes and apples and some other types of fruit emit a lot of what's called ethylene gas. So ethylene gas is basically a gas that comes out of the fruit as it's ripening. And other crops will respond to that gas. So basically, if your tomatoes are putting out a bunch of ethylene gas, that'll cause the other produce to start to ripen and spoil quicker, and it can make it more bitter. So the classic is, if you ever heard from like your grandma, the trick of, if you want to ripen something, you just put it in a brown paper bag with a banana. Bananas put off a lot of ethylene gas, and that's why the banana would cause something else to ripen quickly. Keep in mind that a walk-in cooler is an enclosed space. There's not a lot of air exchange, right? So if you have bananas in there, if you have tomatoes, if you have apples, as they're putting off that ethylene gas, it has nowhere to go. It's going to settle in there and it's going to spoil all of the produce. So that's the reason beyond the temperature ranges that you generally are not going to see things like apples and tomatoes kept in the same cooler as other produce. Um, there's a lot of options. I know when I first started my farm, we didn't have anywhere to put the tomatoes, so I had a pretty clean garage on my property. We weren't keeping like a car in there. We weren't keeping any kind of gas, so it was kind of a food safe spot. Like, oh, that's good enough. We'll just put up wire racks. We'll put our tomato boxes in there. It's kind of cool. As I grew my farm, I eventually ended up building a tomato cooler. So essentially just an air conditioner. We keep it at 60 degrees. It is amazing how much longer the tomatoes last if they're kept at a consistent kind of cool but not cold temperature. We could hold on to tomatoes for weeks sometimes in that tomato cooler, which was very, very different than the situation when it was just kind of even in the garage where there were a lot of temperature swings. So again, if you take away anything from this, don't put the tomatoes, don't put the apples in the cooler. Even very small amounts can be a problem. So even if you're going, hey, I just want to stash my groceries in this cooler for a couple hours. I just want to stash this one box of apples I got from the tree in my yard. That can be enough to spoil significant amounts of produce and make it go bad, and make it not taste good either. Okay, so we've got a lot of different factors that affect the cooling capacity of our cooler. So whether we're talking about a CoolBot, traditional walk-in cooler, chest cooler, whatever, these factors are going to play a really big role in how well we can cool our produce. And we're going to go through these in detail, but the list to start is what's the outdoor temperature? What's the temperature inside of the cooler? How much produce are you loading into the cooler? And especially how much produce you're loading into the cooler at one time. What is the temperature of the produce you're loading into the cooler? What is the respiration rate of the produce you're loading into the cooler? And we'll talk about what respiration rate is in a little bit. And then essentially, how big is the compressor? So how big is the part of your cooler that's actually cooling down the air relative to how big your cooler is? Okay, so to start, outdoor temperature. This is probably obvious, but just to state the obvious, the hotter it is outside, the harder your cooler needs to work, right? Um, Keeping your cooler in a shaded area, like inside of a building, a carport, even under a tent, can make a really big difference. You can actually have a lot of heat transfer from, if you have a walk-in cooler, the outside of the panels are normally metal. If that's heating up, it's cooking, right? And then there's heat that can get transferred into your cooler. So it can make a big difference just keeping it in any kind of indoor or cooler space to start. A really big mistake I see people making is they are planning for a cooler that's going to work with the average high temperature in their area, not the peak high temperature. So we might look up and go, okay, in Minnesota over the course of the summer, on average, the high is 80 degrees. And so we build a cooler that works when it's 80 degrees outside. But the reality is, we know pretty much every August, we're going to end up with a string of days that's in the 90s. Well, we don't want a cooler that's going to fail to work at the hottest part of the season. So plan for a cooler. Like there's some online calculators where you can kind of do the math and go, okay, well, will this size cooler work with this outdoor temperature and this indoor temperature? If you're doing the math, if you're trying to think it through, plan for what you need during the peak of the heat, not just the average heat during the day. Okay, so we're talking about outdoor temperature. Now the next factor is the indoor temperature. So what temperature are we actually setting our cooler at? And the more important piece isn't necessarily the temperature we're setting the cooler at. It's the difference between the outdoor temperature and the indoor temperature. So if it's going to be 80 degrees outside and we need it to be 40 degrees inside, it's that 40-degree temperature range that makes the much bigger difference. For those of you with greenhouses, this probably sounds familiar. It's the inverse problem of the spring, right? When we have greenhouses, we're going, it's 20 degrees outside, but I need it to be 60 degrees inside. Now we're doing the opposite and going, it's 80 degrees outside, I need it to be 40 degrees inside. Um, just keep in mind, the lower the temperature gets, the more energy it's going to take. And in general, it takes extra energy the even colder you get. So it takes more energy to get from 40 degrees to 39 degrees than it took to get from 41 degrees to 40 degrees. So just keep in mind, the colder it's getting, the more energy it's going to take. So if you can run your cooler at a slightly warmer temperature, that is going to be more energy efficient. It's going to need a smaller compressor. You can work with more produce. Undersized compressors are really going to struggle to keep up with lower cooler temperatures. This is especially important if you're working with a CoolBot. And I'll talk a lot about CoolBots later, but because with a CoolBot you're using an air conditioner, you pretty much by definition always have an undersized compressor. I mean, again, keep in mind what you're trying to do. You're taking a household air conditioner that's meant to keep your house at most at 65, 68 degrees, and you're asking it to bring a space all the way down to 35, 36 degrees. So keep in mind those do tend to be undersized almost by definition. I'd also really encourage you, for all the reasons I just talked about, match the cooler temperature to your shelf life needs. So if you're just going to a farmer's market, let's say you're harvesting produce on Friday, you're going to put in the cooler overnight, then bring it to a farmer's market on Saturday. Keeping your cooler at, say, 42 degrees is probably completely fine. There's no reason to really have an issue with that. If you're doing wholesale, where, for example, you need your produce to last for 2 weeks, like Annalisa was talking about, you're going to need to keep your cooler temperature much, much lower. So just keep in mind, you should be matching your cooler to your actual needs, not to some imagined needs. So that's about the farmer's market. That's about how long you need it to last, all of that type of stuff. Okay, so one important concept is there's a difference between the temperature in your cooler and the core temperature of your produce. So when I say the temperature of your cooler, I mean if you hung up a thermometer, what temperature would it say? Right? So if the air temperature is 36 degrees, for example. The core temperature of your produce is if you stuck a thermometer, like a meat thermometer, inside of a bell pepper, what would it read? So the outside of the vegetable might be cold to touch pretty quickly, but because it's dense, like there's a lot of material there, the inside of the vegetable is not going to cool down as quickly. So think about it the same way as if you're cooking a steak, for example. The outside of the steak is going to cook really quick, but if you stick a meat thermometer in it, it takes a lot longer for the inside to cook. So it's the inverse principle here. The outside might get cold to the touch very quickly. That doesn't mean that the inside is actually cool. Denser produce is going to take a lot longer for the core temperature to come down. So if you're doing like kale, the reality is the surface and the core are basically the same because a kale leaf is super thin. But if you're doing something dense, like let's say a sweet potato or a bell pepper, there's a lot of flesh there. So that means the outside and the inside might have very different temperatures. And at the end of the day, what's going to determine how long your produce lasts is the core temperature, not the air temperature. If I have something that has a core temperature of 80 degrees, like a zucchini, and it's in a cooler that's 34 degrees, it doesn't matter that the cooler is at 34 degrees. What matters is that the zucchini itself is at 80 degrees. And again, if you want to figure out what the core temperature is, I would literally just buy a meat thermometer. You can just stick it in there, and you can see what the temperature is on the inside compared to the outside. Okay, another factor that's going to affect cooling capacity is produce load. And what I mean by this is how much produce are we loading into the cooler at one time? So if we're only loading in, let's say, 10 pounds of warm produce into a cooler at once, it's going to be relatively easy to cool that down. If we are loading 2,000 pounds of warm produce into a cooler at once, that's going to be much, much harder to cool down. It's very similar concept to why you've probably always heard you don't want to put like a pot of warm soup in your refrigerator, and the reason is the refrigerator can't keep up with cooling the soup. The soup is literally going to let off more heat than the cooler can cool off. And that means the net effect is you're actually going to end up warming up your cooler and potentially spoiling other stuff. So you have to be very careful about the produce load relative to the size of your compressor and make sure it can handle that. Sometimes that means you want to bring in produce slowly over the course of time. Sometimes that means you want to pre-cool the produce so it's not as rough on the compressor, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. In general, denser produce is going to take longer to come down to temperature compared to less dense produce, so it's going to put more strain on your compressor. So like on my farm, we grew a lot of zucchini. Bringing in 2,000 pounds of hot zucchini, that is a lot of plant material that's really hot, and it's going to take a long time to cool down. That's very different than bringing in 2,000 pounds of kale. And again, keep in mind, those undersized compressors are going to take a long time to bring that temperature down. And again, and I'm not knocking CoolBots. I love CoolBots, but again, keep in mind, CoolBots are by definition undersized compressors. They're not going to do a good job with large amounts of hot produce coming into your cooler all at the same time. Okay, so the next factor that's affecting the cooling capacity is the temperature of the incoming produce. So it's very different if we are putting 2,000 pounds of zucchini into the cooler that's already 40 degrees versus if we're bringing in 2,000 pounds of zucchini that are at 80 degrees. Generally, the colder the produce going into your cooler, the less work the cooler has to do, right? Because if the zucchini is going in at, say, 40 and the cooler's at 38, the cooler only has to bring the zucchini down by 2 degrees. If the zucchini is going in at 80 degrees and the cooler's at 38, now I'm expecting the cooler to bring down the temperature by 42 degrees. That's a lot of work. Um, I would definitely keep in mind there's a couple ways to kind of mitigate this on your farm. Probably the easiest one is just harvesting early in the morning before the produce has accumulated heat. So literally when the temperature itself is cooler. That's especially true with produce like zucchini that maybe you don't want to be washing anyways. I would harvest that first thing in the morning. Keep in mind that if you harvest produce in the evening, it might seem like it's cooler. It's cooler to the touch, the air is cooler, but it's actually been accumulating heat all day. So harvesting the evening is not going to help out your cooler very much. Harvesting in the morning is going to help out quite a bit more. The most effective way to bring the temperature down is the hydrocooling. And so what we mean by that is washing it with water. So sometimes that'll mean dunking it in water. Sometimes it might mean spraying it with water. But in general, we're using water not just to clean the produce, but to actually bring the temperature down. So no different than, on a hot day why you want to get sprayed off with a hose or go to a water park or something like that. Um, Keep in mind, we don't want to hydrocool all types of produce. So things like tomatoes, we generally don't want to wash for both food safety and spoilage reasons. But most types of produce are totally fine to hydrocool. And the reason the hydrocooling helps is it's a couple different factors. One is that the water itself is colder than the produce going into it. So if we harvested those carrots at 70 degrees, but then we dunk them all in water that is 35 degrees, that's really going to help take the heat out and bring it down. We also get an evaporative effect of having some water on the produce when it goes into the cooler. So there's literally more water that's evaporating, that's making it colder. There's also more surface area to cool down as opposed to just the carrot. So there's a lot of benefits to doing the hydrocooling. I would highly, highly recommend hydrocooling, especially leafy greens that spoil quickly. Um, we've talked to a number of buyers who have told us that they can really see the difference in the hydrocooled greens versus the not hydrocooled greens. And the reason is probably the hydrocooled greens are getting down to temperature much, much quicker than if they're just sitting in the ambient cold air of the walk-in cooler. Okay, respiration is one that I'm going to be honest, until about a week ago, I never spent much time thinking about with a walk-in cooler. But after doing some research, I am definitely convinced this is something you need to think about. So different types of produce have different respiration rates. And a respiration rate is the speed at which a vegetable consumes oxygen and releases carbon dioxide. And that determines the rate of decay. So maybe another way to think about this that's a lot simpler is just how quickly is this produce spoiling? Some produce is going to go through the respiration process quicker and spoil quicker. Other produce is going to go through the respiration process slower. So different types of produce have different respiration rates. And one of the effects of a high respiration rate is the produce is literally creating heat as it's decomposing. So it's harder to cool down. So high respiration rate vegetables are things like leafy greens, broccoli, green top root vegetables. All the way on the other side, the lowest respiration rate vegetables are easier to cool down. Those are things like garlic, onions, potatoes, winter squash. And then things like carrots, cabbage, beets, and turnips are in the middle. If you want to look up the full, I put the source on the bottom. Misa actually made a pretty nice guide to this called Harvest to Sale Vegetable Handling Respiration Fact Sheet that lists a lot of other vegetables. But keep in mind, again, this is going to affect your cooling capacity. If you load a cooler with 2,000 pounds of broccoli, it is going to be much harder to cool down that broccoli compared to 2,000 pounds of onions. So that's not to say you can't or shouldn't do it, but this is something that's really worth taking into effect because it's actually a major factor in how your cooler operates and how much it can cool things down. For what it's worth, there's a reason when you look at that high respiration rate vegetable list that those are all vegetables that we tend to hydrocool. That's going to bring the temperature down much quicker, and it's going to reduce kind of the pull on the compressor when we put it inside the cooler. Okay, the next piece is the actual compressor. So just to level set, the compressor is the thing that actually is cooling down the air in our walk-in cooler. So you've probably seen BTU. BTUs are often, if you're buying an air conditioner for a cool bot, it'll say this air conditioner is 5,000 BTU or 25,000 BTU. Um, in this context, that's essentially a measure of the cooling capacity of your cooler. So a higher amount of BTU means it can cool more. A lower amount of BTU means it can cool less. And the size of your compressor compared to the size of your cooler box determines how quickly you can cool produce. So keep in mind, both those factors matter. If you have a cool bot, you know, for example, a 24,000 BTU air conditioner is really big. That's about the biggest household air conditioner you can buy. In an 8 by 8 cooler box, that is a lot of cooling capacity. In a 10 by 20 cooler box, it's not nearly enough cooling capacity. So it's not just the BTUs, it's the size of the box that also determines that. Another thing you want to consider, no matter what type of cooler you have, is how you can get the produce to cool quicker inside of the cooler. So one of the things we found on my farm is how you stack the boxes in the cooler has a really big effect on how fast they cool. So if you're stacking all your boxes on a pallet, so they're all kind of like bunched together and touching each other, think about kind of what's happening with the cold air. If you have a box that's not on the top layer or the outside layer, if you have a box that's on the inside, that box is never getting touched by cold air. So you're essentially insulating that box. It can't get cooled down. So what we like to do is when we first put produce in our cooler, we'd offset the boxes. So maybe we get a pallet and we make sure every single box in the first layer, I could put my hand around it. So it had cold air that could fall. And then the next layer we'd offset from that. So every single box had a lot of surface area around it where cold air could fall. I'd usually do that for about a day, and then I'd condense the boxes after they were cooled down. So keep in mind, you want to think about the airflow around the boxes so you can get cold air all around them so they can cool down quicker. Another mistake I often see people make is just think about the process of how a cooler is cooling things. So we've got the compressor that's cooling the air, and then we've got a fan that's pushing the air out. So if we have a cool bot, those two things are both happening inside of the air conditioner, right? It's cooling down the air and then the fan is blowing it out. Traditional walk-in cooler, we've got the compressor and then the fans. But keep in mind that if the cold air can't touch something, it can't cool it down. So especially in smaller coolers, sometimes what I see is people stack all their boxes up and they're stacking their boxes so high that all the fan air is just hitting the box. And that means then that air is not getting to the other parts of the cooler. So be careful not to block the flow of cold air from the fans or the air conditioner by stacking boxes too high. It's generally a good idea. I like to stack my pallets maybe 5 or 6 boxes high at most. And that way there's plenty of room for the air to kind of circulate and go throughout the entire cooler. Another really important concept is even smaller coolers tend to have hotter and colder zones. Um, if you have a larger cooler, this is going to be really true. So, like when I eventually grew my farm, we had a really big cooler. It was, I think, 16 feet wide by 40 feet long, something like that. So there were a lot of zones in there. Even if you have an 8 by 8 cooler, you're going to find there are parts of the cooler that are colder and parts of the cooler that are warmer. Um, you can easily measure the air temperatures if you're curious by just going in and hanging some thermometers and just kind of seeing what the different temps are. But in my cooler, what we generally found was the air directly under the fans was the warmest. And the reason is because if you've got your fan here, the fans are pushing cold air out, right? So under them is kind of the last part that the cold air will get to because the cold air has to hit the opposite wall, then it's coming all the way back under that fan. So that's where we keep our warmest produce, like the zucchini and cucumbers that like to be at 45 or 50 degrees. What we found is the coldest air was directly opposite from the fan. So because that cold air is just shooting right out to the opposite wall, that wall is where we keep things like the leafy greens that like to be as close to 32 degrees as possible. Based on the shape of your cooler, how you have the fan set up, you may have some different situations, but I'd really encourage you to think that through because it actually made a really big difference for us in terms of how long different types of produce would last. Okay, before we get into actually how we build the walk-in coolers, just a couple considerations. Um, Most coolers can be placed inside or outside, depending on the infrastructure you have on your farm. However, keep in mind that because of what we talked about before, an outdoor cooler will likely need more compressor capacity. You might need a larger compressor because it's actually sitting outside where it's hotter. You should also make sure all of your equipment is rated for the outdoors, as in it's built to be rained on or snowed on, and it should be well sealed. If you notice walk-in coolers that are outside for restaurants or other places, you'll often notice they basically have a fitted tarp over the roof. I would really recommend just doing that for yourself if you're going to put your cooler outside. You don't want rain or water or moisture. You definitely don't want it leaking into the cooler, but you also don't want it getting into the panels because it'll start rotting and kind of dissolving the insulation, and then your structure won't last as long and it won't be as effective. I'd highly recommend installing a door that you can fit a pallet through if you're planning to get to any scale. It makes a huge difference for efficiency and your back. If you're hand moving boxes in and out, that is a ton of work compared to just moving a pallet. I'd also really strongly recommend installing some type of lighting in your cooler. If you have a cooler that's any bigger than like a 4 by 6, you're not going to get enough light coming in through the door to actually see what's going on in there. That makes it very difficult for food safety because you can't clean, you can't see if like a rodent got in there, for example. But it's also just frustrating because then you can't read the labels on the boxes. You might not even be able to identify the type of produce in the boxes. So I'd really plan, you don't need anything complicated, just a very cheap lighting system so you know what's going on. If for some reason you can't install lights, you would not be the first farmer who's used a headlamp when they go into the cooler, but just some source of light is really, really important. Okay, so keep in mind when you are thinking through your cooler, if you're installing a new cooler, you've got to think through the electrical considerations of the cooler. So first of all, remember that many coolers, including CoolBots, often require 220 volt power. So that means it's a special outlet. It's not the standard wall outlet that you have. And unless you're very handy, that's going to require an electrician to install that. Also keep in mind that you don't just necessarily need the electrician. If you're installing a traditional walk-in cooler, you're also going to need an HVAC professional. It is generally not safe for farmers to be installing HVAC type equipment. There's just a lot of safety concerns around the gases, the chemicals, some electrical stuff. If you're installing a CoolBot, you can do it yourself, which is great. But if you're going to do more of a traditional walk-in cooler, plan for the expense of having to hire often kind of expensive professionals to do some of the work for you. Okay, the other thing to consider before you even think about, do I want a cool bot? Do I want a traditional cooler? Is what size of a cooler do you need? This is something where, to be transparent, I often see farmers making misassumptions about needing a larger cooler than they actually need. So I kind of did the math for you on roughly how many bushel and a ninth boxes you can fit in different size coolers. You can see an 8 by 8 cooler, you can fit 144 bushel and ninth boxes in there at a time. And keep in mind, you can empty out your cooler, then fill it up again that same week. Maybe you go to market twice a week. For what it's worth, when my farm had an 8 by 8 cooler or something a little smaller, we were doing over $100,000 of produce sales out of that cooler. So, a pretty reasonable size farm doesn't need a much bigger cooler. You can see as you go down, kind of like a 10 by 20 obviously has a lot more space. The reason I'd really encourage you to think this through is this has a lot of implications for both the cost of the cooler. It also has a lot of implications for what type of equipment you need. So if you can settle for an 8 by 8 cooler, for example, you probably need an air conditioner that can actually work off 110 volt instead of 220 volt electricity. And that means you're going to save a lot of money not needing to hire an electrician. The last thing is, remember, you should determine your size based on the maximum number of boxes you need, not the average number of boxes, right? You need a cooler that's going to work at the height of the summer for you, not just a cooler that can hold the number of boxes you need in June or October. Okay, so let's talk about kind of the first part of a cooler, which is the cooler box. I will give the caveat, I'm going to talk about basically cooler boxes when you're buying panels. You can find plenty of plans online if you want to build your own cooler panels. Generally, that looks like people are building out a frame and then are using spray foam or hiring somebody with spray foam. You can also kind of build your own panels with like rigid insulation and some wood. I personally feel like if you're really handy, go for it. Otherwise, walk-in cooler boxes that are used or panels are kind of a dime a dozen. I don't think it's worth the extra effort to make your own thing for the most part. So keep in mind, this is what a cooler going to consist of: kind of metal flashing on either side. It's going to have insulation inside, and then it's going to have a hook and nub system, which I'll show you a picture of in a second, which is how they attach. If you haven't built a walk-in cooler before, it might be news to you that walk-in coolers do not require any power tools, any kind of permanent construction. Generally, there's no screws, there's no nails. You can take them apart and put them together with an Allen wrench. And that means that, to my mind, these are really appropriate to build on the farm, even if you're not very good at construction. I am by no means a skilled carpenter. I'm, in fact, a pretty bad carpenter. But I've probably built at least a dozen of these over the years because, again, they're pretty simple. It's almost like just large Legos putting them all together. So this is how they attach. You can kind of see on that right-hand side, that's what I was talking about, the hook and nub. So each panel is going to have two sides to it. One side is going to have that kind of hook, and the other side has a nub that it grabs onto. The only thing that moves the hook is an Allen wrench. And then you can kind of see that blown up image on the left-hand side. You literally just put the panels, squeeze them together, just like this, and you just use the Allen wrench to hook one to the other, and that's it. That's the whole thing. So again, these are much simpler to put together than it seems like they should be. So I'd really encourage you, don't be intimidated. If you can do what's necessary for the day-to-day of your farm, you can absolutely put together a walk-in cooler. And if you have trouble with it, I can help you with it. That's a lot of the work me and Annalisa do.
Hey, Ariel, remind folks what the Allen wrench is.
Sure. So the Allen wrench here is this little 90-degree angle piece that is, oh, I wonder if I can use oh, this highlighter here. Let's see here. Oh yeah. All right. Look at that. So that's this thing right here. So basically an Allen wrench is what you're going to stick in. There's a pre-sized hole inside every panel, and you're just going to stick that in, And as you wrench it, that's what's going to actually move the hook on it. So that's what Allen wrench is. You can buy these at a hardware store. Literally, you can buy a kit of them for $20. They're useful for a lot of things on the farm, so I'd highly recommend kind of considering getting those for your farm anyways, and then using them on the panels. Uh-oh. Now I've got now I've got my marker on here. That's what I get for being ambitious. Give me 1 second. I might just have to. Oh, there we go. Great. Okay. So we talked about the box. The next step is you have to consider a floor. So a well-insulated floor is essential to a walk-in cooler of any type. This is whether it's a CoolBot or a traditional compressor. You can place the cooler box over a concrete pad. I mean, a concrete pad kind of serves as a floor, but I think an insulated floor is pretty essential for both the cleanliness and the energy efficiency of the cooler. Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. Okay, so if you're putting down a new concrete floor, maybe I'll talk for a second about why we need the floor. So keep in mind that what we're doing in a cooler is we're cooling the air. And warm air rises, cold air sinks. So that means if we don't have an insulated floor, if say we put our box over the ground, beyond the food safety concerns, we're losing all that cold air through the ground. We're not keeping it in our cooler. So that's why we really need an insulated floor to make sure that the whole space works. I think I was reading somewhere that the floor can have as much of a 30% effect on how well insulated and how well you can cool down your box. If you're putting down a new concrete pad for your walk-in cooler, you might want to consider installing insulation under the concrete. That's something that it's literally just the rigid foam and then the concrete goes on top. You could build a floor out of excess cooler panels. That's what I did with my cooler. We just had more panels than I needed, so we chopped them up and used that for the floor. You could build a floor using rigid foam insulation and a material like HDPE, which is basically just hard plastic. Um, there's a lot of ways to do the floor, but I really recommend no matter what you do, think about a floor. If you're buying a used cooler box, just know that in general, walk-in freezers come with floor standard. Walk-in coolers do not. So it's pretty normal to get a walk-in cooler that doesn't have a floor as part of it. So just make a plan like that one with the rigid foam and HDPE or extra cooler panels. If that's your situation, I'm happy to talk it through with you. If you're buying a brand new cooler from a place like CoolBot, they do offer some options where they also come with floors. I think it's always worth investing the extra whatever amount of money to get the floor. Okay, so we kind of talked about the box. We talked about the floor. The next big thing is now how are we actually cooling the air in the cooler? So first, it helps to kind of understand what a CoolBot is, and then we can talk about what a more traditional compressor is. So CoolBots allow you to use an air conditioner instead of a traditional walk-in cooler compressor. Um, this means you can often build and install the cooler yourself, which is really nice because the compressor and the fans that you need a professional to install in a traditional walk-in cooler are all just part of the air conditioner. CoolBot coolers are also much easier to uninstall and move compared to traditional coolers because you don't need to like pump down the compressor. You don't need a professional. So CoolBots are really, really great if you are on rented land, if you think you're going to move the cooler at some point, because you don't have that double whammy of having to pay a professional to set it up, then take it down, then set it back up again. And this on the right-hand side, by the way, this is the CoolBot controller unit. So the way this controller unit works is it overrides the temperature sensor on an air conditioner and it tricks it into staying on for a longer period of time. So basically what you do is you end up buying an air conditioner that was meant to cool down a 600 square foot house. You put it in a 64 square foot cooler box, and then the CoolBot tricks the air conditioner into saying, hey, I think it's too warm in here. I should stay on. I should keep getting down to a lower temperature. CoolBots generally work best for smaller coolers that don't have heavy produce loads. They're not going to work well in a poorly insulated cooler or a cooler that's open frequently. So again, just going back to that point about these are, by definition, undersized compressors. So I would not recommend using this in a situation with the poor insulation, with a lot of produce, something that's going to put a lot of pressure on the compressor. So in general, go with a traditional walk-in cooler if you need a larger cooler. especially anything larger than a 10 by 20. If you've got a large amount of produce going in at the same time, also if you're doing wholesale, your produce is not going to last as long in a cool bot cooler. So it might be totally fine for smaller wholesale accounts, for farmers markets, for things like that. But if you're planning to sell to like a large distributor where they need the produce to last 2 weeks, this isn't going to work well for you. Um, Traditional walk-in coolers will be more expensive up front and have higher installation costs, but they are going to work a lot better for those kind of larger wholesale type accounts. Okay, so what does it cost if we're talking about CoolBot coolers? Um, I'm going to say I'm not going to talk about the cost for more traditional walk-in coolers because so much of that cost is wrapped up in the installation of them. So you're really going to have to talk with whoever the local installation professionals are to get a good feel for what it's going to cost. Um, I will say that for traditional walk-in coolers, plan for probably the box, the compressor, and the fans to only account for maybe half to two-thirds of the cost. The professionals really are going to charge quite a bit to get everything else set up. But maybe you're lucky, maybe you have someone in your area that's a little more reasonable or is used to working with smaller farms. So I will give you the caveat, these prices here are, I think, about 6 months old at this point, although from what I can see, I don't think they've gone up much from when I've talked with Coolbot. This gives you an idea of what they cost. This is if you're buying everything new from Coolbot. So this is if you're buying the new walk-in cooler box, a new Coolbot unit, and a new air conditioner. So again, you can see like an 8 by 8 might cost you about $9,000, all the way up to a 10 by 20 is going to cost you close to $20,000. So you know your context best. Um, these might be prices that don't scare you, and if they don't, this can be a great option. Like anything in life, if you buy something new, it is going to be much easier to put together than if you buy something used where you're kind of always suffering from somebody else's headaches with how they took it apart or not knowing the history of the equipment. All that being said, I often talk to farmers who are looking at these prices and go, I need a cooler. I don't have $8,000. That's a crazy amount of money. So I want to give you some options for how we can think about this in a way that is going to be more affordable. Just keep in mind, again, as we save money, we're committing to spending more time and probably some more stress as we deal with finding used materials, putting them together, dealing with the people we have to source them from. Also, just real quick, I want to point out before I move on, take note here, the 8 by 8 cooler is the only one that uses 120 volt electricity, right? Any of the bigger coolers, you need that 220 volt outlet. So even though you're shelling out for everything brand new, you would still need to hire an electrician to install that outlet on your farm if you wanted a larger cooler. Okay, so I think the easiest way to save money is buy a new air conditioner, buy a new CoolBot, because those are going to be relatively small amounts of money in the grand scheme of things. So like a new CoolBot unit is about $350. Even the biggest air conditioner you can find will be $700 or $800. But then buy a used walk-in cooler box. And the reason is you tend to see a lot of these cooler boxes going for very, very cheap. And the reason is because they're kind of just unsightly and annoying as a new person takes over a property. So if a restaurant goes out of business and now it's turning into a retail location, they don't want that cooler. And in fact, sometimes they're willing to pay somebody to get rid of it. So this is a real scenario I ran with that picture on the left. This was on Facebook Marketplace maybe about 9 months ago. So they were selling the 8 by 8 by 10 box on Facebook Marketplace for $1,000. So this exact listing. You can buy the CoolBot unit for $350 and the air conditioner for $800. So that means if we're willing to source this box used and do some of that work, out the door now, we have an 8 by 8 cooler for $2,150. If we bought that brand new from Coolbot, we'd be spending $8,000 to $9,000. So again, there's a huge cost difference there. For many of us, that's the difference in between whether we can afford to do the cooler or we can't. That's a saving of $6,000. Keep in mind, you are going to have some trade-offs. So generally, the used boxes are going to have worse insulation than newer boxes. And that's because the insulation degrades over time inside of the panel. So older coolers, by definition, do not have as good insulation. And it's also because there's been some new materials that have been developed, more modern materials that have better R value or insulation value than some of the material that's in the older cooler panels. So I would plan if you're using the Coolbot website tells you how big of an air conditioner you need for different size boxes. Plan for a bigger air conditioner than what Coolbot says if you're buying a used box compared to buying a new box from them. Okay, remember that if you've kind of got two different situations here. So this one is kind of nice because they already took the panels apart. So they saved you a bunch of work. So there's not too much you have to worry about in terms of taking this apart. The big thing you have to do is just account for all the panels, make sure it's all there so you can actually put the whole thing together. Oftentimes you'll see listings like these where somebody goes, I'll give it to you for a steal, but you have to take it down. So keep in mind, actually taking apart the panels is pretty easy. It's the other stuff that comes along with the cooler that can be a lot of work. So you do not want to be the person disconnecting the cooler from electricity or refrigeration equipment. That's going to require a professional, and that's going to cost money. And this is not just something where I'd say you just don't have the skills necessarily. It can be really unsafe. So I'd really encourage you, these should be jobs for a professional. Keep in mind, sometimes coolers, especially in environments like supermarkets, the structures might be literally bolted into the floor. So you might need to get a way to get them out of the floor. And keep in mind, sometimes the panels are going to be rusted together. So when I kind of showed that photo before of how they attach with each other with like, the hook and the nub, keep in mind, if a cooler's been up for 30 years, those two things have been attached to each other for 30 years. They've never been moved. So there might be a bunch of rust. Sometimes that means you might need to cut them apart. Honestly, I found in my experience, if you can spray some WD-40 in there, let it sit for an hour, and then you can kind of slam it with a hammer to knock all the rust off, 99% of the time, that's going to work. So again, just to reiterate, situations like this, I think are very preferable to situations like this, where you've got to do a lot of work taking things down. Okay, sometimes you're going to end up with a situation where it's not somebody's cooler. Like they don't even remember the situation. There's a shockingly large number of these where people just go like, they don't even know the story. It's just I got a pile of panels in the woods. Or, when I bought my barn, there were a bunch of panels in there. So the upside is these are really cheap. This is going to be the cheapest situation you can find. The cooler on the right that you can see, that was actually my first walk-in cooler. That was my first CoolBot cooler on my farm. I built that out of mismatched panels. It's hard to fully explain to everybody how broke I was when I was starting my farm, so everything was done as cheap as humanly possible. When you buy mismatched panels, the hook and nubs might not even line up because these panels might be from different coolers. They might not match up with each other. Believe it or not, you can actually just spray foam the panels together. That cooler in the photo on the right was 100% held together with spray foam. Not a nail, not a screw, none of those kind of hook and nub systems worked. The reason I love showing this photo is if you pay careful attention, you can see my trusty Chevy Astro has a chain attached to it. And that was because the landlord did not like where I put the cooler. So we had to drag it across the property to another spot. The spray foam structurally was sound enough that even dragging the entire cooler across the farm with my truck, it didn't break anything. It all held together. So that spray foam really turns into super glue. If you use spray foam, I would strongly recommend using the blue bottle that's for windows and doors. And the reason is because with windows and doors, you don't want it to expand, right? Because you don't want it to bow out your window or your window frame. Same thing with the cooler panel. You're kind of using it to glue them together. You don't want something that's going to expand because that'll push the panels apart. If you buy these kind of, junk piles of panels, keep in mind to make sure it comes with a door and a frame. Cooler doors are really expensive. That's not something you want to have to buy after the fact. They're sometimes $500 to $1,000. So whatever you buy, you want to make sure it already has a door and a proper frame for it. If it has wood, like these ones do, make sure the wood is free of rot and the insulation's in good shape. Double check all the panels and make sure that they will roughly match up with each other. So what's not uncommon is you might have freezer panels, which are 4 inches thick, and cooler panels, which are 3 inches thick. They're not going to match up together really well. Um, and just take a count, draw a picture, and make sure you have all the panels you need in terms of wall, ceiling, and floor to build whatever structure you want to have for your farm. Okay, anybody who's been to my presentations knows I am a big fan of people finding stuff cheap. I literally pulled these pictures this morning from Facebook Marketplace, so if you need a cooler, you can do your own search. Again, this stuff is always available. So the left-hand side, 1,500 bucks for that giant pile of panels. That was a listing where they said what I just said. They don't even really know where they came from. It got donated to like a thrift store. So you'd have to kind of do your own math to see if you have everything you need. The one in the middle is a 5x6. It's a total complete box. It's got the floor. That's 2,700 bucks. The one on the right is much bigger and more expensive. It's, I think, a 10x12. All of these will be cheaper than buying a new box. So I'm not trying to disincentive or tell you don't buy the new box. I'm just saying if money is tight, if money is the difference between you having a cooler or not, buy the used supplies. It's going to make a huge difference for you. No matter what you do, keep in mind you need the cooler to be super well insulated. So especially if you're buying a used box, the two biggest things you can do to make sure your cooler is well insulated is one, seal up any holes or cracks. So the easiest way to see if there's any kind of cracks or holes or place heat's getting through is after you've built your cooler, go inside and close the door. And anywhere you see light coming through is places where you're losing heat or you're losing cooler capacity. The other thing I'd recommend doing is investing in vinyl strips to cover the doorway. So if you've ever worked in a restaurant, you know, it's pretty common. You open the door, it's got those vinyl strips going through. That'll stop you from losing a whole bunch of cold air every time you open and close the door. The vinyl strips will cost you 50 bucks. But it's just a no-brainer investment to kind of make it a more efficient space. Last, I just want to go over some other options here. You can retrofit things that are not boxes with CoolBots. On the left-hand side, some people like to insulate trailers so they can move it around to different sites. You can buy shipping containers that you can insulate. So especially if you can buy a pre-insulated shipping container, they actually tend to have really, really good R values, really good insulation. That's something where you can install a CoolBot. On the right-hand side, that's actually my truck. And we installed a CoolBot on the truck. I would really recommend you have a professional do this because you're messing with the body of the vehicle. I did this so I could load my truck the night before with the produce to go to farmer's market, plug in the CoolBot, and then the morning I could just unplug it and leave. If you do farmer's market, you know, I mean, at least for me, there was nothing worse than having to wake up at 5 in the morning and load a whole ton of boxes onto my truck. So just being ready to go was super, super nice. Finally, there are some other types of coolers out there you can consider. I would just really encourage you to think about it. So I see a lot of people like the floral coolers, that one on the left where it's got windows. Those are really poorly insulated. Glass is not a good insulator for cold air, so you're losing a lot of cold air through that glass. Makes sense for the floral shop because they need you to see the flowers to buy them. For produce farmers, I think you're going to regret buying something like that. The middle is like a reach-in cooler. If you're a really small farm, that can work totally fine. Just keep in mind again, like you can probably fit 7 or 8 boxes in the largest kind of reach-in cooler. So you're going to be very, very limited for the amount of produce you can get in there. On the right-hand side, again, it's very similar to the floral cooler. Those are retail coolers. You often see them up on the internet for really cheap for a reason. They're really inefficient because, again, you've got a whole side of it that's not insulated, and you're going to lose a lot of cold air. So I'd really encourage you to probably not consider any three of these. I don't think they're a great solution, but you know, in the end of the day, it's of course up to you. All right, that's what I got. I do think we have got a couple minutes for questions. See, somebody in the chat had a question. So somebody said, what are your thoughts on building a box by framing up a shed and insulating it? Yeah, Marcos, I think that's totally fine. You know, especially if you have kind of a unique space that you need to fit it into, framing it up can work really well. If you're going to frame it up, I'd really encourage you to consider hiring somebody, like build out the frame and then hire somebody with a spray foam rig. Spray foam tends to have a much, much better R value in the end of the day than some of like the rigid foam panels. So that can be a really nice way to do it and just have them kind of get all the foam in there. Um, if you're not handy like me, to be honest, I just prefer the panels because they're so easy. But yeah, I think framing it up totally makes sense. If you are going to do the shed, I just again encourage you, make sure the floor and the ceiling are also getting insulated. You need all four sides to be insulated well to make the cooler work. Yeah, if anybody else has questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or take yourself off mute.
While we're waiting, I'm going to launch the poll as well. So if you wouldn't mind answering those questions, that would be awesome and helpful for the future of our series.
And we'll put in one last plug just while we're waiting that if you're interested in going to that cooler day, it's going to be a lot of fun. So definitely let us know.
Ariel, do you think that you could talk a little bit about using things, the shed was mentioned, but also we got a question the other day about the just box, some people have random kind of like large structures, boxes on the farm. And what are some considerations when someone's going to do that and use a cool box?
Yeah, so I think if you have a box or a structure and you are comfortable framing it out and using the spray foam, that can work fine. I personally feel like a lot of the time you're going to spend as much money and work as having just bought a cooler box that was kind of intended for that purpose. The other thing to consider is the size of it. So keep in mind that the nature of a cool bot especially is you've got this big air conditioner, you've got this unit. That's not going to work well inside of like, let's say you've got like a crate that's a 4x4. You need somewhere for the cold air to go. You need somewhere for the air conditioner to sit. So it's not going to be a great solution. In the end of the day, it's probably going to be cheaper just to build a larger space. And for the vast majority of produce farmers, you're probably going to want at a minimum like a 4x6, something like that. So you've got enough room to actually walk in, walk around, put some boxes on the pallet. So I would consider that, and like with anything, I just consider the value of your time. So if you just love fixing up stuff and framing it, it's not a question of the value of your time. You're doing something you like. If you don't like doing that type of thing, you're probably going to find you're not even paying yourself $5 an hour for the amount of time it's taking to do it versus just buying the thing that was meant to be used for it.
The other consideration would be the material on the inside, making sure that it is a smooth, cleanable surface. Because when you buy panels, it's already going to be that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not uncommon. I see that people are using some materials that maybe aren't the end of the world, but I wouldn't recommend. Like if you're using something like OSB or wood for the floor, um, in the grand scheme of things, I don't know if that's like the biggest food safety risk, but it's certainly a bigger one than having a surface that you could easily clean and sweep. I've also seen people where they don't want to really put flashing on the inside, so it's just like exposed spray foam. I wouldn't recommend that for two reasons. One, you can't clean it by definition. Two, that stuff will eventually start flaking and chunking off, and you do not want a little piece of spray foam in a box of vegetables somebody's getting. So to Annalise's point, I plan to have a finished space. If you're building your own shed, I think one of the nice options can be using milk paneling, if you've ever seen that. So it's kind of like a smooth, easy to clean surface. You can usually buy that at a place like Bernard's in like a 4x4 sheet. You just screw it on and you're done. But I think I'd plan for that cost as opposed to trying to save a couple bucks and you're just going to regret it over time.
Any other questions? We'll give people a minute. Formulate any questions or thoughts you have. Well, I will just put a plug in that we do pay for some of Ariel's time to do presentations like this, but also to help folks one-on-one. So if you do want to shoot him an email and ask questions about, will this work? Do you have suggestions as I build this? I think that's okay, right, Ariel?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we'd love to. I would also say too, depending on where you're at, if you just want to have a basic, do I need a cooler conversation or how big? One of the things I do a lot for farmers, which takes no time, you can just email me a Facebook Marketplace listing. Go like, does this seem right? Is this a good price? Should I consider this? Depending on the time of year, sometimes me and Annalisa can also make site visits and help you out with that too. We just had a farm last year where their CoolBot wasn't working and we were able to help troubleshoot with it. So yeah, I'd say wherever you're at, we're happy to have the conversation.
Well, good. Okay.
Great. Well, thanks everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Ariel, for the great presentation. Thanks to Lauren for the assist. Have a great day.